Welcome to those of you who are here in person and also online. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the VCUarts lecture series. My name is Catherine Roach. I'm an associate professor in art history here at the School of the Arts at VCU. And I'm delighted tonight to introduce my colleague, Hala Auji, who is presenting her research, Facing Pages, Exploring Mass Portraiture in Arabic Print. Hala Auji is an associate professor of art history and the Hamad bin Khalifa Endowed Chair for Islamic Art. Informed by her interdisciplinary background in graphic design, criticism and theory, and art history, Auji's research explores the history of the book, print culture, cultural modernity, museum practices, and portraiture in the Islamic world, with a focus on Arabic-speaking communities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Her work evidences intersections between book history, manuscript studies, art history, design history, comparative literature, and Islamic and Middle East studies. She is the author of Printing Arab Modernity, Book Culture and the American Press in 19th-century Beirut. And at VCU, she teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on the material culture, design, art, architecture, and exhibition history of and about the Middle East and the wider Islamic world. So tonight, after the talk, there will be time for questions. And those of you who are joining us remotely can submit a question using the chat or Q&A function of Zoom. And with that technical note, it's my great pleasure to welcome my colleague.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's lovely seeing a lot of my students in this different context and my colleagues. I also want to thank the VCU School of the Arts Dean's Office for this invitation, as well as the ICA for hosting it and for all the tech support. It feels so professional. I wasn't expecting this. So today's talk comes from a portion of my ongoing book project related to printed portrait images in the context of the Eastern Mediterranean during the long 19th century, specifically amongst Arabic-speaking groups in the Ottoman Empire. So this is just a sliver, a mishmash of sorts that I've been working on for the past few years. And I'm looking forward to the questions that you may have about it. Sorry, sorry, I can't find the mic. Okay. So I'm going to start with a set of portraits that I came across in 2018 at the American University of Beirut, where I worked for about 7 to 8 years. Published at the Al Hilal, which means the Crescent Press in Cairo, around 1914 or 1915. The date is not clear. These are dates that I'm attributing to it. This image collection of eminent men of the East who made up a group of Syrian, Lebanese, and Egyptian individuals, is a group of 16 printed placards. Each placard consists of a large format, black and white printed portrait with a caption noting the name of the figure. The back of each image includes a biography that emphasizes the individual's contributions, which ranged from the literary to the political, to there's a long 19th century intellectual movement known as the Nahda al-Arabiya, which in English means the Arab Renaissance, but I'll refer to it as the Nahda moving forward. This mass-produced project, or object, strives to canonize not just the work of these contributors to the Nahda, this intellectual movement, but also their portraits and biographies as eminent men of the East, who were idealized as scholars, journalists, politicians, and proponents of social and linguistic reforms. The collection, it's not clear who authored it or who worked on it, but it was likely printed after the death of the Al Hilal Press's founder, who was a Syrian emigre journalist named Georgi Zaidan, and he was a self-fashioned early historian of the Nahda, with numerous books on world, Islamic, and Arab history. Within this collection are portraits of key Nahda scholars like Nasif al-Yaziji and Butros al-Bustani, whose work I really focus on in my research. And their scholarship was really central to emergent notions of Arab national identity, debated amongst cultural practitioners in the 20th century. And today, some of you might not be familiar with them, but these are very key figures in Lebanese intellectual history. Interestingly, similar portraits were painted between 1920 to 1930 by the Lebanese artist Daoud Qirm, who is often hailed as the father of Lebanese modern art. It's not clear which works came first, the printed portraits of Qirm's paintings, the printed portraits or Qirm's paintings, but there may have been an overlap in producing both of these two. And often when I present this talk somewhere where people are familiar with these figures and these works, they often tell me, oh no, these were Qirm's paintings, those came first. So there's always a debate of what came first. In this talk, I examine images that blur boundaries between different mediums, timelines, and techniques, suggesting their significance in shaping perceptions of the public intellectual amid emerging Arab nationalist ideas. Drawing on insights from cultural and literary historians like Walter Armbrust, I stress the importance of visual and experiential readings of mass culture in Arabic print media. At the same time, my views are informed by photography historian Jeffrey Batchin, who advocates expanding the visual boundaries of photographic history to incorporate images existing in various media. This approach ties the history of photography to the social implications of capitalist mass production, while also locating the photographic image as a non-medium specific apparition. That is, and I'm quoting Batchin here, detached from even while it remained inextricably tied to the photograph itself. Today, I will focus on the portrait image of one figure, Nasif al-Yaziji. This is not because he's considered more significant than other figures at the time. Rather, the availability of his numerous posthumous portraits allow us to explore the visual genealogy of printed portraits that date back over 40 years before the image that I started with was produced in 1915. Although al-Yaziji sat for a photograph or maybe more during the early decades of photography in Beirut, he died in 1871, so there isn't a lot of time for him to have sat for these images. To my knowledge, none of these photographs exist today. In fact, I believe that the original photographs were also unavailable to most of the engravers, publishers, and editors who reproduced al-Yaziji's likeness throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Beginning any research as one does with a Google search, a Google search of Nasif al-Yaziji yields myriad digitized versions of al-Yaziji's portraits, whose original images or sources are impossible to trace. However, widely circulating reproductions from the great to the awful are not unique to our contemporary context. In fact, although my first encounter with al-Yaziji's portrait was through a cutout albumin photograph pasted in this book held at Harvard University, this photo was not how al-Yaziji's image first circulated in publication. The concept of the original here was always a reproduction, akin to early photography's history. It urges us to shift focus away from origins and to contemplate the history of portrait imagery within Batchin's notion of a dispersed and elusive discursive formation stemming from the desire to capture images through photography. Relatedly, Roland Barthes implied that photography should be understood beyond its technological processes, as a collection of culturally coded meanings and expectations. This idea resonates with contemporary research methods, especially in my own work, where I grapple with how digital access to publications and images alters the original medium and imbues them with new meanings. And I say this here because although I have had the opportunity to see some of this stuff in person, much of my research actually takes place online today. So today's technology enables global and a rapid access to images, a capability that was unavailable to original audiences. With digitized materials, scholars can analyze 19th century publications in ways that were unfeasible before. However, this data is a reproduction of the material under study and should be understood as such to counter essentialist narratives. As a result, we need to continuously question how our tools and methods actually shape our work. This necessitates a slow reading, as Sheldon Pollock explains, conducted with a heightened awareness of what it is that we're actually reading and what we are doing when we're actually reading. So sort of assessing our actions. In art history, slow reading and slow looking are not a new thing. They entail a careful, deliberate engagement with objects and texts, emphasizing immersive examination to uncover nuances, ambiguities, and underlying meanings. They encourage reflection on language, structure, and themes within historical and cultural contexts through close textual analysis, and most importantly, repeated readings, repeated viewings, and interpretation that reveals layers of significance. And I say this here because you will see me doing this, repeating images over and over again, sometimes mind-numbingly so. So please bear with me, because this is really a crucial process for the portraits that I study, because they were part of a broader visual and textual group of collections of works and not standalone images. These were never meant to be images on their own. So slow reading really reveals how editors and publishers conceptualized authorship and public intellectuals, revealing late 19th century practices that played a key role in early 20th century constructs of modern art and national or communal identity in the Ottoman realms. Now, a good example of what this kind of study can eventually reveal, and one that I really don't get into here, but it's something that I'm currently working on, is the history painting that you see here by the Lebanese artist Mustafa Farouk, who's a very well-known, very popular artist. And this was produced during the time of the founding of the Lebanese Republic. Using methods and tropes from Western Orientalist traditions, the painting imagines Hala Auji in an encounter with a ruling emir from the mid-1800s. And again, although I won't discuss the painting today, it exemplifies the importance of Nahda figures for early Lebanese nationalist artists like Dawood Karam and Farouk. This interest in such scholars was not really stemmed in the canonization of their scholarship, but I argue in the commodification of their portraits through image reproduction and dissemination that was taking place in the long 19th century. So to make things easier to grasp, I'm organizing this talk into 4 interrelated parts. I think of them as conceptual nodes that I'm using to map this work, but also so that you know there's an end coming. Between 1839 and 1876, the Ottoman world witnessed state-initiated tanzimat, or reforms, leading to extensive changes in education, military, economy, and even fashion. The empire's involvement in the global capitalist economy spurred the emergence of a bourgeois, merchant, and intellectual class who came from various multi-confessional communities and were actively involved in local transformation. Provincial centers like Beirut in Ottoman Syria and Cairo in Khedival Egypt, with substantial non-Muslim minority populations, aimed to emulate Istanbul's modernization programs, becoming hubs for transformative developments among their multi-confessional Arabic-speaking residents. And this is why I tend to focus on these cities. The Ottoman state's urban, economic, and educational reforms had a significant impact on the cultural developments of the region, particularly the Arab Nahda. In the second half of the 19th century, a private Arabic publishing industry emerged. Through literary scientific periodicals, books, and miscellaneous prints, many of which included translations into and from other languages, this industry gained importance as a marketplace for the negotiation, dissemination, and circulation of Nahda ideologies and interests in key regional urban hubs. Press editors and publishers, who were typically venture capitalists for the most part, also came from middle-class professions. They were surgeons, doctors, teachers, engineers, and lawyers. They worked in agriculture. They ran the gamut of different professions, and they considered themselves udaba, which means men of letters. By the 1880s, these editors as scholars took on an even more a socially proclaimed role as journalists. And journalist in Arabic means sahafi. It also means public writer, or katib am, which is a little translation of that. So in their self-proclaimed new public role, these public scholars fashioned a self-image as purveyors of social reform, progress, and civilizational discourse in the interest of what we call in Arabic, maslaha amma, which means public benefit. For those working in Syria and Egypt before the mid-1900s, the figure of the public scholar was being conceived of in a transitional moment of overlaps between empire and colonial presence, printing practices and scribal traditions, and guilds and professionalized labor. For these editors, the public that they were producing work for really consisted of people just like them. Middle-class individuals, both men and women in Egypt, the Ottoman world, and international locations where presses had agents. So while the publications were aimed at non-specialist readers, they did not target the indiscriminate masses. In fact, historians of the Arab press estimate that only about 1% or even less of society purchased books or subscribed to periodicals by the early 1900s. However, if we think creatively about reading practices at this time, we can imagine that these practices likely included wider circulation of publication content than the numbers suggest. In the 1700s, for instance, spaces like coffee houses and theaters facilitated public discourse, as did religious contexts like mosques and seminaries. Additionally, despite the often restrictive late Ottoman publishing laws, privately operated journals and presses managed to circulate their publications within public and private settings, with some possibly being viewed or read out loud in cafes, although many scholars contest this, or at least at the home, private home with illiterate family members who were often women. Cultural historian Stephen Sheehy argues that print media created a textual space, enabled diverse readers to engage with various contents. To this, I would add that images, like portraits, were vital to this environment, as they didn't demand textual literacy to be appreciated, contributing to an accessibility of the discourse. Through print media, engraved and lithographed imagery circulated within the realm of this negotiated or even imagined public space, from reading rooms to salons, cafes to public squares, to the private spaces of the home. They may have also found their way onto everyday locations like storefront shutters, as we see in this extremely rare example here. This is the only example I've come across so far, but you can see that there are numerous portraits and printed imagery on the interior of that shutter. The opening of private photo studios in the region in the 1860s, coupled with the prevalence of new engraving and lithographic technologies, led to the posthumous portraits of celebrated scholars frequenting the frontispieces of Arabic books printed at private presses in the cities that I mentioned. While this practice really becomes popular by the late 19th century and early 20th century, one of the earliest examples, and perhaps the earliest example, of an author portrait in an Arabic publication is that of Nasif al-Yaziji. In 1872, the Beirut-based French Jesuit press, established in the 1840s, printed the first posthumous author portrait and edition of Nasif al-Yaziji's Compendium of the Tusis, or Majma' al-Bahrain in Arabic. The initial edition was published by al-Yaziji himself in 1856 at the American Mission Press in Beirut. Following his death in 1871, it's possible that his son, who at the time was employed at the Jesuit press, decided to commemorate his father by publishing the second edition of this book after his father's death. Ultimately, the book became really popular, more popular after Auji died than when he was alive, and a very financially rewarding enterprise in the following decade. New editions were printed by various presses across the Arab world. And here I'm just showing editions from 1880, 1882, and 1885, but there are a lot of editions that went on to be published in the 19th century. Significantly, these posthumous publications mark the debut of the renowned early Nahda scholar's portrait on the frontispiece. For publishers, incorporating such portraits served to validate posthumous editions, lending publishers a sort of cloak of legitimacy and authority. Literary historian Janine Barkas has suggested that author portraits in 18th century Britain signify that the publication was sanctioned or initiated by the author of the work. Relatedly, like title pages, author portraits served as advertisements in an increasingly competitive print market. Images like these thus exemplify the merging of print capitalism with the commodification of authorship. As a member of the Ottoman Syria's Greek Catholic community, Nasif Auji, like other non-Muslim minorities who sought to advance their socioeconomic status in the pre-Tanzimat era, trained as a scribe and as a private secretary. In 1835, he was hired as an Arabic instructor and a text corrector at the Syrian mission of the Boston-based American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. This is something that I talked about extensively in my first book, where I explored how Auji, among others, during his time at this Protestant mission in Beirut, printed numerous self-authored books at their press. He was among the first local scholars to write with the printing press in mind. So while scholars who came before him were thinking about text as manuscript, he was producing text for the printing press and not translating things from manuscript to print. And one thing I argue in my book is that despite the missionary beginnings of this press, it transformed into a secular publishing hub that was almost fully funded by multi-confessional Syrian intellectuals and community members. Auji printed his first edition of the compendium at this press during the early 2 decades, during at least 2 decades before publishing, 2 decades after publishing his first book there. So essentially his first book comes off the press in 1837, and then his magnum opus comes out 20 years later. By then, he was among the early print scholars who were renowned for their role in lexicographic debates during this period. Auji's compendium was his take on the 11th century Abbasid scholar Al-Hariri's classical maqamat. The maqamat are essentially a genre of short fiction that emphasizes a sort of pyrotechnics of writing. It's supposed to be like a riddle of sorts. This particular textual genre was really popular during the 19th century. There were over 100 different versions of it that were produced at different presses. So Auji's take on it really exemplifies his interest in upholding this classical Islamic literary genre and connecting himself to this Islamic literary history. And it's important to remember, though, that his work belongs to a wider regional trends when it comes to sort of reviving early Arabic literary works in printed form. So analyzing the printed portraits across various editions of Auji's compendium from the late 19th century reveals small but also major alterations in both the visual conventions and the mediums that were used to create these visuals. These editions were primarily printed in Beirut between 1872 and 1885. And here I'm showing frontispieces from editions printed at or for the Jesuit press in 1872 and 1880, as well as one 1885 edition from the American Mission Press. Although the book's title pages clearly list press names, cities, edition numbers, and dates, as many scholars of print history know, the chronology of this type of information is extremely problematic and raises a lot of questions when you actually start to dig into the nitty-gritty of where these things were produced. So for now, I'll start with the 1880 Jesuit edition. This book's frontispiece was the only one showing a photographic print. So this is distinct in that way. This is an actual photograph that is pasted, an albumin print that was cut out and pasted onto the page. Below the image is an epitaph in the classical qasida form, which means rhyming couplet. But before I delve into the intriguing poetic text itself, I want to touch on the portrait. The image, possibly printed from a glass negative, and again, this is something that I'm figuring out on my own because there is no glass negative. It shows the scholar facing the viewer with his shoulders angled to the right. Looking closer, you really notice, after you look at it for a really long time, that the portrait sometimes also looks like a painting. So it gets to be very confusing. This is because the image was likely retouched directly on the negative, which was a very common practice in early history of photography. If we look here, we can see how the neckline was redrawn or maybe even scratched out. The shirt stripes are emphasized. They almost look like an illustration. His right ear comically folds over in a rather distorted manner. The headdress shows details, trying to create a certain texture. This is not simply image correction or using a filter or retouching an image. It's actually, this is an argument that I'm making, an attempt at adding some weight to the photograph. By making the image look like a cross between a painting and a photo, the image maker lends the final product the feeling of an illustrious scholar's portrait. This is not just any type of photograph. This is not a photograph for ID purposes. Auji wears the typical pre-Tanzimat attire of Ottoman Syrian scholars and scribes, which are often referred to as al-sheikh. So his name is also al-sheikh. It's a title, it's an honorary title that is associated with him. So we see the cloth headdress, the kaftan overcoat, and a high-waisted cloth belt holding in place his billowy traditional trousers, which are not in the image itself. His scribal tools, a pen case and inkwell, called a kalamdan in Arabic, connected by a chain, emerge from the folds of his belt. These items, along with his more traditionalist outfit, serve as a customary marker of his education, of his training, and also of his privileged status as a language instructor and a man of letters. These attributes signify the orthodox visual iconography that Stephen Sheehy, in his Social History of Nahda period Ottoman Arab photography, has explained as, quote, ideological codes and indexes of the Nahda portrait, end quote. Comparing the visual iconography of Auji's portrait to that of younger Ottoman Syrian scholars reveals a generational cultural gap. An 1871 image featuring Boutros al-Bustani shows younger scholars adopting the fez, a symbol of Ottoman modernity over headwear, over traditional headwear. And you see here, the portrait shows, the different generations all at once, which is really why I love this image. So what we're seeing here is sort of a photographic trend in middle class subjects at this time between the 1860s and 1870s, where they pose in traditional or Western attire, often with books or leaning against furniture. Sheehy describes these representations as embodying the idea of the new Ottoman Arab subject, where sitters express and perform their modernity and class through repeated semiological and rhetorical visual patterns. Returning to Auji's image, two different portraits appear in two copies of the earlier editions printed at the same press in 1872. So there are no additional dates in the books. They're both printed in 1872. There's no other details, yet they have completely different images at the beginning, different frontispieces. It's not clear which portraits came first, again, if we want to think about origins, that's sort of a moot point, and whether the frontispieces were even produced at the same press. Some may have been produced elsewhere and then shipped out to be added. When looking at the portraits together, while we can see some resemblances, they all look remarkably different from each other. And they were also produced using different printing methods. So although the left and center portrait look like they were based on the photograph that we were talking about, they are not reprinted from its negative. In fact, the sitter was rendered completely differently in each, if we look very carefully. The difference is most noticeable in the 1872 example where the print, unlike the other examples printed on letterpress, is a lithograph, which may have been produced at the Italian Orientalist painter Leonardo da Mango's atelier in Istanbul. The problem is his atelier was established after the publication of this, supposed publication of this edition. What's really interesting is sort of the creative license taken here by the artist. Ali Auji's face appears more expressive and weathered, rendered in short strokes of crayon that really accentuate his facial lines and his crinkly mustache. While his coat, shirt, pen case, and cloth belt, which if you look really closely, can see it's bearing a sort of pseudo-Arabic script pattern that my students and I have been talking about in my undergrad class, shows a level of modeling that is absent from the other examples, including the photograph. Images of Ali Auji were not limited to editions of his books published at the Jesuit press. We see a similar interest in these images at other regional presses, like the American Mission Press, which published a version of this author portrait in an 1885 reprint of Ali Auji's compendium. Now, what's notable about this, and some of you might not be aware, is that these two presses and their corresponding missions, both located in Beirut at the time, have a very well-documented, albeit somewhat exaggerated, rivalry, which translated to competition on all levels, competition for converts and a competition within the book industry. But what the portrait here shows that, in the way that the American version almost replicates that of the 1872 Jesuit edition, is that they may have used the same plate. This tells us that there was more of a creative exchange going on between competing presses than is typically noted in the more ideological approaches to this history. Although by the 1880s, this portrait and epitaph combination was most closely associated with book frontispieces, a format-centric reading of this practice is quickly complicated when considering the wider circulation and reproduction of this imagery. For example, I was really surprised to find that the first time that this portrait appears and the eulogy and the epitaph appears is when it's accompanying the eulogy that appeared in print of Ali Auji's obituary, published in an 1871 edition of the illustrated monthly journal Al-Jinan, or The Gardens. It gets us to thinking about who the initial author, original author may have been of the eulogy, of the epitaph that you see, for instance. It could have been written by the journal editor, or even by one of the editors who worked at this press, Boutros al-Bustani, who was his very good friend and his colleague at the American Press and the Mission. The engraved vignette set above Ali Auji's obituary text recalls aspects of the photographic print from 1880, but instead of a bust portrait, this relief print appears to depict the author in a seated or standing position, leaning his elbow on a desk or chest. What I find compelling about these portraits is their diverse production methods and pictorial modes, even within copies of the same edition, that may have been produced by different engravers and at different sites. This reveals the varied modes of production within the supposedly standardized realm of print, where books or journals often featured pages printed using different formats. Such examples highlight the medium's mutability, challenging its perception as an unchanging and its association with stabilizing text and imagery. So now let's focus on the eulogy that I've sort of been avoiding, that accompanied the frontispiece portrait. Through a slow reading, we can understand how publishers and editors associated deceased authors and scholars' portraits with contemporary views on mechanically reproduced figural imagery, revealing shifting perceptions of portraiture and image making in the late 19th century. Written in a rhyming couplet, this epitaph appears beneath each of the portraits. And if you look very closely, each time it looks a little bit different, like it was drawn with a different hand or engraved by a different person. This poetic couplet, while becoming a popular accompaniment to posthumous author portraits as the decades move forward, it is not unique to this medium or to this particular time or context. This memorial text has a very long tradition in Islamic and non-Muslim funerary contexts. Relatedly, the poetic eulogy was the form in which posthumous tributes to authors appeared in manuscripts long before printing practices. And Hala Auji himself has also worked on this within this tradition and was well known for being a great writer of eulogies. So despite appearing in his book, and it seems to make sense to think of it as an author portrait in connection to the book, the epitaph does not act as a tribute to Hala Auji himself, his eminence, or his scholarship. It doesn't even allude to the book's content. Instead, it seems to be referring to the nature of the printed image above it. Written in the first person, the poem acts as a conduit through which Hala Auji addresses readers from beyond the grave. I won't read the Arabic to save time, but I'll just read my translation of it into English. I pass, yet my image remains, so be amazed. Realities pass and pictures, and this is a translation of al-rusumu, which can mean pictures or traces, remain. Life brings on death, for if death possessed, or hawa, a soul, then the drawn figure would have died. This is a very intricately contrived couplet that I've been spending years translating and working through, and it lends itself to multiple readings. The epitaph's possible reference to traces or remnants through the word al-rusumu seems to allude to the notion of the trace or athar in Arabic. At the most basic level, this epitaph seems to signify an understanding of photography's indexical nature, namely indicating the causal link between subject and image, while portraying the mechanically produced image as a trace of the captured physical reality. This line of thought also evokes Jacques Derrida's concept of the traced, which he defines as, quote, the mark of the absence of a presence and the mark of the absence of a presence and always already absent present. According to him, the trace is, quote, a simulacrum of a presence that dislocates, displaces, and refers beyond itself, end quote. The epitaph suggests that the image of the now absent author functions merely as a simulation of his presence, prompting viewers to marvel at a technologically produced likeness that transcends time, though it clarifies that the image's resemblance is solely a representation of and not a substitute for the original. Yet in the context during which this epitaph was written, Derrida didn't exist, right? Traces can have other meanings. In Islamic theology, for instance, traces or athar are associated with the Prophet Muhammad's relics, such as his recorded statements known as ahadith. In Arabic literature, this concept is also understood for its duality as trace and effect. Al-Rusum, or traces, also evokes the traces of calligraphers or writers who often leave behind, leave their work with their inscriptions on them, on their completed works, to really signify the text's enduring presence. So in some ways, this epitaph exemplifies a certain continuity with local literary traditions at the time. Another intriguing aspect to consider here is the term hawa, or to possess, possibly linked to hawi, which is a magician or a snake charmer. Here, hawa may connote both possession and enchantment, aligning with the perceived magic of a mechanical image capture. With these points in mind, one can read this text as implicitly referencing debates on image making or taswir at the time, both in connection to Islamic ahadith on the subject, as well as the Judeo-Christian tradition. So for instance, one of these hadiths, so the recordings of the Prophet, things that the Prophet has said, states that among the people who will be most severely punished on the day of resurrection will be the image makers. Another states that the makers of these images will be punished on the day of resurrection, and it will be said to them, breathe life into that which you have created. By these accounts, image makers are set to face dire punishment on Judgment Day, when God will hold them accountable for their inability to bring images to life, since creation is God's exclusive domain. Now, similarly, an Arabic version of the Ten Commandments from Exodus, sourced from an edition that Al-Auji himself translated for the American missionaries in Beirut, notes, you shall not make for yourself a graven image or likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. Do not prostrate to them or worship them. So views on image making were really often unsettled at this time, and they were being negotiated amongst theologians and scholars. Later religious rulings, called fatwas, acknowledged the potential benefit of image making when it's divorced from the risk of idolatry. For instance, Egyptian Grand Mufti Hamad in a 1904 article noted, Islamic law is far from prohibiting image making, one of the best tools for learning, after it has been established that it's not a threat to religion. For Abdo, image making can be used as a valuable educational tool, emphasizing its historical and cultural significance. In his view, concerns about imagery are really rooted in the threat of idolatry stem from the early Islamic period and are pretty much outdated by the 1900s, in his opinion. Contemporary perspectives on image making are also intertwined with discussions on photography, and I won't go into them today, but just things to keep in mind. Seemingly engaging theological debates, the epitaph explains that while death releases the soul to the spiritual realm, the image remains a timeless trace of a physical presence. In other words, the epitaph notes that while the image bears a likeness to Al-Auji, it is a simulation and cannot possess the subject's soul, no matter how real it looks. This challenges the notion of photography capturing a sitter's essence or spirit. Thus, it resists idolatry, and it makes clear that images pose no danger to religion. As scholars of early photography recognize, similar debates on the religious permissibility of the photographed image also prevailed in Europe. This is not unique to the Islamic world. And many European observers at the time viewed photography as both miraculous and blasphemous. So what this epitaph shows us is not only how image makers were engaging with new technologies, but how they were articulating views on these methods in relationship to dominant ideas on figural representation at the time. The varied frontispieces in Al-Auji's publications reflect how publishers commodify the deceased author, capitalizing on his status. Each new edition introduces what seems to be an improved portrait alongside it, but the text is unchanged. This echoes industrial capitalism, a concept that Walter Benjamin associated with photography's reproducibility. In Benjaminian terms, this endless reproduction paradoxically distances us from the aura of the original photograph, while making Al-Auji's image temporally and spatially closer to us. Yet this comes at the expense of the commodification of the author's image and our relationship to it. The continuous cycle of reproduction evident in these portraits highlights the mutable nature of mechanically reproduced images and underscores the central role of reproduction and dissemination in the history of portraiture and photography. Further evidencing the mutable nature of these images and the wider popularity of author portraits is their continued appearance in various forms in the early 20th century. For instance, here we're seeing a portrait that appeared in Jurji Zaidan's 4-volume tome on Arabic literary history. Also published at Zaidan's press were the placards that I mentioned early on. And here one can see how the publisher is recognizing the potential lucrativeness of mass-produced portraits. As editor and self-professed public scholar, Zaidan had a vested interest in publishing and popularizing local and global histories, which were very trendy at this time. This is evidenced in sections on his subject in his journal, Al-Hilal. So for instance, every issue of his journal, Al-Hilal, which means the crescent, appears with a portrait at the front, on the front cover, on the front page. And these portraits accompany biographical essays on figures who were local but also Western and came from, the widest range of historical periods. Relatedly, it appears that Al-Hilal's collection of the printed portraits that I talked about may have been inspired by Everett Duykink's Portrait Gallery of Eminent Men and Women of Europe and America that was published in New York in 1873. Duykink's book included steel engraved portraits of individuals that were accompanied by biographies, and you can look this up online and see it online. The Egyptian portrait collection almost appears as an anti-colonialist response to Duykink's emphasis on the Western figures by underscoring the Arab East's contributions to modernity in literature and political thought. However, an interesting thing is that Duykink's printed gallery included women. Al-Hilal's collection did not. This is really strange, because portraits of Western women, like those directly taken from Duykink's publication, were reproduced in Cairo-based journals and Beirut-based journals at the time, as seen in this example. Arab editors viewed women, local women, mainly as consumers, and they focused on domestic issues. So they often included articles in their journals on home economics and child rearing geared towards women, and that's how they engaged their female audience. But despite this, records show that women were active as editors, publishers, and authors since the very inception of the industry. By the late 1800s, many of these women, particularly in Cairo, played pivotal roles in key journals and led a lot of these key journals. For instance, Yazji's own daughter, Warda, wrote for her brother's journal, Illuminations, or Diya. And she was a very popular author in that journal. So despite male dominance, a few journals were also led by women. And these contributions have often been overlooked by the Nahda scholars, not by contemporary scholars. When local women featured, they were noted for as a sort of a gratitude or extension of thanks for the work that they did. So in this example of a book by Philippe de Tarazi on Arabic journalism, he includes a portrait of Labiba Hashim, not because he saw her as a valuable scholar, but to thank her for helping him acquire a lot of the images that he then published in his book. But Labiba Hashim published one of the first journals focused on women in the region and became a very important scholar. This is not, so essentially they're acknowledged for their assistance and not for their own intellectual contributions. Now, speaking of Tarazi's work, another portrait appears that brings us back to the discussion of Al-Yazji. Here we're seeing an image that was printed in this book in 1916, and it seems to actually reproduce or produce the original seated photograph by the German photographer Julius Lindt. And this image is lost to us today, so it probably wasn't even available to this publisher or other publishers. But this is the only time that I've seen this particular image that was produced here. Its closest copy is probably the wood-cut engraving that we saw in Al-Jinan. Al-Auji's public scholarship is also highlighted in a number of other journals and texts such as Georgi Zaidan and others publications that connect the photograph of, or the reproduced photograph of the scholar to his biography and his achievement. And so it is through this particular method of reproduction and dissemination that we see Al-Auji's image moving from that of a simple man of scholar, of letters, to a public intellectual who is working towards public benefit. An interesting point about the materiality of these works, thinking about dimensions, the books make sense. You understand how they would have been viewed. The placards don't make a lot of sense to me. I'm still trying to understand how they would have been viewed, how they would have been circulated, especially since imagery was not really allowed to be just pasted randomly on public surfaces. It may have made its way. I think my view is you have to think of them as sort of the cabinet cards or the carte de visite that were very popular at this time. And I'm going to explore this some more in my book. So the examples I showed today reveal how portraiture was used to canonize Nahda literature and intellectuals, and how these Egyptian and Syrian figures were really engaged with an interest in anti-colonialist and nationalist ideas in a very light way. But by the early 20th century, these individuals were retroactively located as public scholars or reformers. And so that we see that transition that they went through from men of letters. So to conclude, and I went way over time, I want to underscore that general audiences in Beirut and Cairo and other Ottoman provincial cities were seeing and learning about key historical and contemporary figures through printed portraiture. Publishers and editors in this increasingly competitive market made deliberate selections and omissions of images. In addition to textual content, they were focusing on imagery, and this is something that I am emphasizing and I'm arguing for. This is especially the case in the Ottoman world, but this is something that you see in many other parts of the region, in Iran or South Asia. What's also interesting about these examples is it reveals how circulations were taking place among the various production sites, including Istanbul, Beirut, and Cairo, with the US and Europe and possibly other connections. So the mass printed portraits that I presented today demand a nuanced methodological approach for a real understanding of their significance. They exemplify the fluidity of technological image production, again, challenging notions of print stability. And analyzing their dissemination reveals what Batchin calls photography's double displacement, where subjects are alienated from their photographic image and the image from its form. Focusing on dissemination destabilizes the photograph's identity, undermining fixed certainties and declaring in Batchin's terms, quote, that photography is the name of a problem rather than of a thing, end quote. A study of these images also reveals the complexities of dissemination, particularly this issue of transregionality, that challenges ethnocentric and nationalist views of photographic and print history. Offering an alternative way for us to study portraiture, dissemination allows for consideration of images and their histories beyond our field's preoccupation with narratives of origins or ideas of singular works. Relatedly, as my colleague in the audience, Eric Garberson, has noted, portraits are not identified or understood solely by medium or likeness, but by their conventions. And these conventions were itinerant and historically contingent. This reminds us that the genre of portraiture itself, like all other genres in art history, is informed by Eurocentric constructs and conventions that create a hierarchical categorization of artistic production and producers. However, examples like these suggest an opportunity to challenge these conventions, not only in relationship to non-Western practices, but also within the field writ large. And thank you very much. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We have time for a couple of questions, I think.
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes. Yeah.
I will start, if that's okay. Thank you, Hala, so much. I really enjoyed listening to your talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your choice to study Arabic print culture combined with your background of being a graphic designer.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of an easy way out for me. It's something that I was intimately familiar with, and something that I actually practiced as well. I worked at a letterpress, so I was very interested in that particular connection with my background. But also, I realized the more that I learned about letterpress printing, the more I realized that there's no writing out there about the visual dimensions of letterpress printing in the Arab world. And so this was really the reason that I got into it. It was a little bit easy to make that choice, but it was hard to try to convince people that this is an important thing to consider.
Thank you.
Yes, over here.
Lama.
Hi. So I wanted to ask specifically about the portraits that are in front of us of Yazdaji, or his name. I wanted to ask the text that's under it, the bit sha'r that was written under it, how often is that, how often does that show with the portraits? Is this a special case that he decided to write this bit for a specific reason because he had to write the hadith that he wrote previous to it? I'm sorry, does my question make any sense?
Wait, yeah, I mean, can you, I wasn't hearing all of it, so.
Sure. The portrait.
Of Al-Yazdaji, you mean specifically?
Yes. He wrote a bit under it, the poetry that's
eulogy.
under it.
Yes. Yeah, the thing at the bottom.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm speaking
He
Arabic
didn't write it.
English.
I don't know who did.
We don't know who did.
No, I don't know who did. He wrote it. It sounds like he wrote it.
Yeah.
But it only appears in his obituary for the first time. I don't know who wrote it. I can't pinpoint that. I've never seen it again. But what's really interesting is that it becomes inextricably connected to the portrait, so much so that even when I've looked at editions of this book that didn't have an author portrait, some people penciled in that particular epitaph.
Yeah.
So anytime his portrait appears, that epitaph appears alongside it. And it's become connected to him, although, you know, I try to imagine that maybe this is what he thought of the printed image, because he was, you know, he was active from the early 1800s to 1870 when he died. And, you know, photography is invented in the 1820s or so. By the time it makes its way to Beirut, it's around 1840, 1850. So he probably took this photograph around then. It may have been a daguerreotype photo, and he may have been thinking about what this photo meant, you know? I mean, I like to imagine that that's the possibility here, but it's a very rare type of epitaph because the majority of them are about the individual and the individual's contributions. So it's unique because it's the first time that we're seeing an author portrait, but it's also unique because I haven't come across an epitaph like that one since.
Yeah, I was going to follow-up question. I was going to ask if portraits are common to have epitaphs under them or not. But yeah, you answered the question. Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
You mentioned this wonderful history painting from the 1930s.
Right.
You said you weren't going to talk about it, but I was
know.
It's a history painting. Tell us about it. Could you tell us about that picture and how it fits into this proliferation of the image? And
Yes, so I knew someone was going to point to that painting. As I debated with myself, and I'm like, Hala, take it out, take it out. But I wanted to include it because that's where I want to go. With all of this, what I'm interested, elaborate presentation, sorry, click, 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 click. I'm interested in going to that point where we can talk about that particular painting in a way that connects this elaborate print history to this type of an artwork. In the context of studying modern Arab art and modern Lebanese art, scholars start with the artwork and don't think about what was going on beforehand, particularly when it comes to Mustafa Farouk's work or Dawood Kurm. The students, grad students are familiar with their work. We've talked about it in my courses. So they don't think of Farouk as having engaged with figures like Nassif al-Yazaji and others in his thinking. The history painting, the only reason I still don't have a lot of research on it is it just became public through the Sursuk museums. Because of the explosion in Beirut, they had to go through conservation of all the works and repair. And then they started digitizing these works. And so now this is something that I have never seen before. And I only came across it a few days ago, really, as I was thinking about this material. But I found that it's a really important connection here, because in addition to al-Yazaji that you can see here, this is that figure. This figure is more recognizable of Amir Bashir. If you look up Amir Bashir, if you Google him, you will see that this is a portrait, like that there's a photographic, it's not a photograph, he died long before the photograph, but the illustration of his portrait that is repeated in the media looks a lot like what you're seeing here. So I find it interesting that it's almost an allegorical portrait of sorts, and you know, the artist is playing with these historical ideas, and my argument is that he only has access to this through the dissemination of Yazaji's image. So he was probably not reading Yazaji's texts, but he knows of this image through its endless reproduction. And that's the argument I'm trying to make. I haven't done the work yet, but I'm getting there. Yeah.
It's really exciting. Do we have a question from our virtual audience?
Does not appear so.
Well, I do see that we are almost out of time, so I want to thank Hala so much for this. Thank the audience for coming, and to ask yes, big round of applause.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.